Hey guys, it's Will from Learnerator, and in this video I'm going to wrap up the 2012 AP Microeconomics FRQ section with question number 3, which is related around tariffs. So let's go ahead and get started. In this case, we are presented with the question that states, sugar is freely traded in the world market. Assume that a country, Learnerland, is a price taker in the world market for sugar. Some of the sugar consumed in Learnerland is produced domestically while the rest is imported. The world price of sugar is $2 per pound. The graph below shows Learnerland's sugar market, and PW represents the world price. So at the world price of $2 per pound, how much sugar is Learnerland importing? So looking at this as you go through your planning period, you want to think about what is the overall supply for the domestic supply for Learnerland, and what's the actual domestic demand for this amount of sugar. And that's going to kind of tell you how this question is going to shake out, because as you can clearly see from just taking a quick gander at the chart, you see that the price for sugar on a world level is much lower than the equilibrium for the country itself. So that means that looking at the first question, if the price is 2, then we need to see where the supply lies for domestic supply, and then we need to see where the demand lies. So let's go ahead and identify those 2 points. In this case, we have the world price of 2, and the supply for that is going to be 2, so supply equals 2, and then demand equals 14. The difference between that is going to be how much we import, because this is the amount in millions of pounds of sugar that is not being met by the overall domestic supply, and therefore demand minus supply is going to equal imports. So 14 minus 2 is equal to 12, and that's all you need to do for question number 1. Let's go to question number 2. So part B states, suppose that Learnerland imposes a per unit tariff on sugar imports, and the new domestic price, including the tariff, is $4. So let's go ahead and draw a line there to show what that new unit price is. It's $4. So we need to first identify the new level of domestic production. In this case, that's just going to be where the domestic supply is in this case, so which is going to be 6. So Q equals 6 million. Next, we're asked, calculate the domestic consumer surplus for Learnerland. You must show your work. Okay, so here we need to think about what is the value derived from the purchasing of the good. In this case, we want to figure out what is the entire triangle above the price that they're paying at the world price, including the tariff, and what they're all willing to pay. So therefore, we want to take into account this triangle right here, your classic consumer surplus solution. So knowing this as your consumer surplus right now, we know that that is going to be a half times base times height. And we know that this height is going to be 9 minus 4, which is 5. And we know that this base is going to be 10, because it's 10 minus 0. And therefore we have a half times 5 times 10. A half of 10 is 5. 5 squared is 25. And therefore your answer is 25 for the domestic consumer surplus. And just to make sure that you understand producer surplus, your producer surplus would be that small triangle right there below the price that consumers are paying. Alright, so now let's think about part 3B, the overall total tariff revenue collected by the government. So in this case, we need to think about what is the difference between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied at that price of 4, because that's going to give us the overall quantity difference, which is going to account for the total tariff revenue. So in this case, we know that the difference is here, 10 minus 6. So the total tariff revenue is represented by this rectangle right here. and we also need to figure out what the tariff is. So in this case, we're given that the new price including the tariff is 4. We know that the original price from part A was 2, therefore your tariff is 2. And we know that the quantity that is imported on those imports is 10 minus 6. So 2 times 10 minus 6 million. So that's 2 times 4 million, which is equal to 8 million. So that's part 3B. So again, to go over that, we first had to figure out what is the tariff amount. In this case, we know that the new world price with tariff is 4. We know that the old world price was 2. Therefore, 4 minus 2 is equal to 2. Then we had to come up with how much was being imported, which is the difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded at the domestic level. And therefore, we had 10 minus 6 mil, and therefore 4 million times 2 is 8 million, and that is your total revenue from the tariff. Now let's think about part C. Given the world price of $2, what per unit tariff maximizes the sum of Loreland's domestic consumer surplus and producer surplus? So first let's think about what happened when we imposed that $2 tariff on imports. What we saw was that your consumer surplus became this triangle, this pink triangle, and then we saw your producer surplus increased to this very light cyan blue triangle. So we saw an increase in the overall producer surplus, but we also saw a decrease in the consumer surplus from imposing a tariff. And what we need to think about is what would the consumer surplus and producer surplus be in the case in which we have it set at world price equals 2. Well, in that case, we would actually have an even bigger area in that we would see that the consumer surplus is actually this entire triangle. So you see that there's this huge triangle of consumer surplus, and then there's a tiny little triangle of producer surplus right here. But what you need to account for is that in the case where we set price equal to the world price, we have such a huge gain in consumer surplus that overall, if you were to add it for total social welfare, so total welfare equals consumer surplus plus producer surplus, we would know that at the world price of $2, the consumer surplus is substantially larger than the tariff or any tariff that you could impose. I mean, you can think about this. If we were to impose a tariff of, $4, we'd be set here, and your consumer surplus would keep going down, your producer surplus would go up, but that overall change is not big enough in comparison to the original situation where you had a very substantial consumer surplus. Therefore, we would want to actually set a tariff of $0, and that's because at that point where we set a tariff of $0 and set it to the world price, we actually see the highest amount of consumer surplus, and with a tariff you may increase the producer surplus, but the decrease in consumer surplus is substantially bigger than that increase in producer surplus. So that's the way that you'd explain it. The increase in producer surplus is going to be much less than the decrease in consumer surplus. And so that's pretty much it for this question. Pretty simple, just going over tariffs and the influence of tariffs. If you need extra help, feel free to check out Learnerator for hundreds of AP Micro practice questions. All of our easy and medium questions are free. That's it for now. I'll see you guys next time.